The rain was coming down so hard that night that I couldn't see the white lines on the road anymore. I remember the sound of the windshield wipers, that frantic, uneven slapping rhythm, and the way Daniel's jaw was set tight, the way it always got when he had already made a decision he hadn't told me about yet. We were 7 minutes from home. I know because I had just checked my phone. 8:43 p.m. Thursday. He pulled over without warning. No shoulder explanation. No, I need a minute. He just eased the red Toyota onto the gravel edge of Route 9, put it in park and said, quietly, almost gently, "You should get out here." I turned to look at him the way you look at someone when you're certain you misheard them. I hadn't misheard him. The door was already unlocked. What happened in the next 4 minutes changed the rest of my life. Not because of what Daniel did, but because of what I found when I got home. My name is Elena Marchetti. I kept my maiden name professionally, even after I married Daniel Hargrove 4 years ago, because I had built something under that name that I wasn't willing to dissolve into a hyphen. I was 34 years old that Thursday night on Route 9. A licensed occupational therapist with a private practice, I had spent 6 years building from a single rented office on Clover Street into a 3-therapist clinic with a waiting list that ran 8 weeks long. My practice grossed $312,000 the year before all of this happened. I paid my own malpractice insurance, my own staff salaries, my own continuing education fees. I was not a woman who needed to be rescued. But I had made one very significant miscalculation. I had married someone who knew that about me, and had quietly been using it. Daniel was 37, regional sales manager for a medical device company. Charming in the specific way that people who sell things for a living are charming. Warm when he needed something, distant when he didn't. When we met at a mutual friend's dinner party in February 6 years ago, he had laughed at all the right moments and remembered 3 weeks later that I had mentioned I liked Ethiopian food. He showed up to our third date with a reservation. I thought that meant he paid attention. What I didn't understand yet was the difference between someone who pays attention because they care and someone who pays attention because they're calculating. I was the reliable one in our marriage. The one who set up the automatic bill payments, filed the joint taxes 2 weeks before the deadline every year, remembered to schedule the furnace service before winter. Daniel called me the architect as a joke between us, because I was always building the structure that held things together. That Thursday night, standing in the rain on Route 9 with headlights rushing past me, I finally understood what I had actually been building. And why it was time to stop here is what I want you to understand before I tell you what I found on Daniel's phone. The betrayal didn't begin that Thursday. It had been assembling itself quietly for at least 14 months. The way damage behind a wall works. Invisible until the day you press your hand against the paint and feel it give. It started with small things I talked myself out of noticing. The first thing was a weekend in March of the previous year. Daniel told me he had a regional sales conference in Columbus. 2 nights, company-covered hotel, boring but mandatory. I drove him to the airport myself on a Friday morning, kissed him at the departure drop-off, told him to text me when he landed. He texted me at 2:17 p.m. Landed safe. Hotel's nicer than expected. 6 weeks later, I was reconciling our joint checking account, something I did every month because Daniel, for all his professional polish, had a genuine indifference to financial tracking, and I found a charge. $387. Lakeview Suites and Conference Center. 41 minutes from our house. Not Columbus. I sat with that for a long time. I told myself there was an explanation. Maybe the conference location had changed last minute. Maybe the company had booked locally that year. I did not ask Daniel because, and this is the part one I'm least proud of, I was afraid of what a direct question might confirm. So I filed it. Not in a drawer. In my mind, where I kept things I wasn't ready to look at yet. The second thing was his laptop. Daniel and I had always had a loose, comfortable kind of privacy in our marriage. Not the invasive kind of transparency, but the relaxed kind. Phones left on the counter, computers open on the kitchen table, passwords known not because we demanded them but because they'd been shared casually over the years the way couples share these things. In September, I noticed his laptop required a new password. I noticed because I had gone to print a document using his machine while mine was updating, and the login screen stopped me. I made a small joke about it at dinner. Since when did you go maximum security on me? And Daniel laughed and said the IT department at his company had pushed a new security policy. Personal devices too, liability reasons, the usual. It was a good answer. Smooth. Proportionate. The kind of answer that doesn't leave you anything to hold on to. But I noticed. The third thing, the thing that shifted me from uneasy to certain, was a phone call I was not meant to overhear. It was a Saturday afternoon in November. Daniel was in the backyard. I was in the kitchen making coffee and the window above the sink was cracked open 2 inches because I liked the cold air while I cooked. I heard his voice, low and deliberate, the register he used when he was being careful. I told you I can't talk right now. I'm at the house. I know. No. It won't always be like this. Another pause. Then quieter, almost tender in a way that turned my stomach, me too. I stood at that window with my hands around a coffee mug that had gone cold, and I didn't move for a long time. I didn't confront him. Not that day. Because here is what 14 months of quiet observation had taught me. I was not dealing with a careless man. Daniel was careful. Daniel was managed. If I confronted him with suspicion and no proof, he would give me another smooth, proportionate answer and I would be left with nothing but the feeling, and a husband who now knew I was watching. So I made a decision that afternoon that I believe saved me a significant amount of money and pain. I started keeping records. Charges, phrases, receipts. The Columbus Conference receipt, printed and dated. A note about the laptop password change with the approximate date. A voice memo I recorded in my own handwriting. Time, location, what I heard, word for word. I didn't know yet what I was building. But I had learned from somewhere that the truth, when you finally find it, is much easier to use when you've already been preparing a place to put it. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't that I want to tell you exactly what it felt like to stand on the side of Route 9 in the rain. Not emotionally. Physically. The water came through my coat within 90 seconds. That specific, miserable moment when fabric stops pretending it's protecting you and just surrenders. My left shoe had a small separation at the sole that I had been meaning to get fixed for 3 weeks. And within a minute the sock inside was completely soaked. The gravel under my feet was uneven. Headlights kept sweeping past me, close enough that I could feel the displaced air, and not one of them slowed down. I was 2 miles from our house. I stood there for 4 minutes before Mrs. Patricia stopped. She was 68 years old, a retired school librarian from the next town over, driving home from her daughter's house in a sensible gray Buick with a rosary hanging from the rearview mirror. She pulled over cleanly, put on her hazards, and rolled down the passenger window. "Honey," she said, looking at me the way a woman looks at another woman when she understands something without being told. "Get in the car." Got in. She didn't pry. She handed me a folded microfiber cloth from her glove compartment, the kind people keep for glasses, and she drove me to my street without asking for an explanation I wasn't ready to give. When I got out at the corner, she held my hand through the window for exactly 1 second and said, "Whatever it is, you're going to be all right." Thanked her. I walked the last 100 feet to my front door. And that is when I saw it. Daniel's personal phone, the one he always kept in his left jacket pocket, never on the counter, never out of reach, was sitting face up on the kitchen counter next to the fruit bowl, buzzing. He had left in such a hurry to get wherever he was going that he had forgotten it. The screen lit up as I walked past. "Ashley, why is it taking so long? I made dinner." I stood in my wet coat and looked at that message for a long moment. Then I picked up the phone. He hadn't changed the passcode. It was still our old building number from the apartment we had lived in when we first got together. 1142. I had teased him once about using sentimental numbers as passwords. He had called it romantic. I scrolled. I will not read you every message because some of them I have chosen to let go of, not for Daniel's sake but for my own. But I will tell you this. Ashley was not new. The thread went back 11 months. There were 847 messages. There were photographs. There were conversations about the future, their future, that were specific enough and detailed enough that I understood immediately this was not a lapse in judgment. This was a parallel life. I sat down on the cold kitchen tile. Still in my wet coat, one soaked shoe, the microfiber cloth still in my hand, and I stayed there for exactly 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock on the microwave move from 9:14 to 9:25. Then I stood up. I went to the bedroom. I got my tripod from the closet shelf, the small one I used for patient video consultations. I set Daniel's phone against the fruit bowl at an angle. And I photographed every single screen in that message thread, 847 messages. Methodically, without rushing, the way I had been trained to document a patient assessment by 11:30 p.m., the photographs were uploaded to a private cloud folder and the phone was back on the counter exactly where I had found it. I was in bed, eyes open by midnight. When Daniel came home at 1:07 a.m., I was pretending to be asleep. He checked on me, stood in the doorway for a moment, then went to the kitchen, found his phone and exhaled, a long, quiet breath of relief. That was the moment everything shifted. Because he thought he had gotten away with it. And I needed him to keep thinking that for exactly 9 more days I am, by professional training and personal temperament, a record keeper. In occupational therapy, documentation is not a bureaucratic inconvenience. It is the entire architecture of care. Every patient session I have ever conducted has a written record. Date, presenting concerns, interventions used, measurable outcomes, follow-up plan. I have been doing this for 11 years. It is not something I switch off when I leave the clinic. Which is why, in the second bedroom we used as a home office, I kept a cream-colored accordion file that held every significant document from our marriage, organized by category, labeled in my handwriting, updated every January. The morning after I photographed Daniel's phone, I opened that file. I was not looking for anything specific. I was looking for everything. What I found over the course of 3 hours at the desk with a yellow legal pad and a cup of coffee that went cold was a picture I had never fully assembled before, because I had never needed to look at it all at once. The first document that mattered was the mortgage. Daniel and I had bought our house 3 years ago, $334,000, 30-year fixed, joint names on the deed. Standard. What was not standard was a clause his own attorney had inserted during closing at Daniel's request, designating me as primary financial controller on the account servicing agreement, because at the time, Daniel's credit score had a blemish from a 2018 tax lien that his lawyer wanted buffered. He had explained this to me briefly at the closing table, and I had signed without fully absorbing the implications. The implication I now understood was that I had unilateral authority over the account management structure of our shared mortgage. Not the deed, but the financial instruments attached to it. I wrote that down on the legal pad and circled it twice. The second document was the co-investment disclosure. When I had expanded my practice 2 years earlier, adding 2 additional therapists and moving to a larger space on Meridian Avenue, I had taken a $40,000 business expansion loan in my name. Daniel had contributed $18,500 of his own savings as a co-investor, and we had signed a straightforward co-investment agreement that my business attorney had drafted. The agreement specified that his $18,500 represented a non-voting interest in the practice's expansion capital, with returns tied to clinic revenue growth over a 5-year period. What it did not grant him was ownership stake in the practice itself. I had known this technically at the time, but I had not understood how important that distinction was going to become until I was sitting at that desk with a yellow legal pad, reading the clause my attorney had written almost offhandedly. Co-investor interest does not constitute equity ownership in Marchetti Occupational Therapy LLC, and conveys no claim to practice assets, goodwill, or licensure value in the event of dissolution of the personal or professional relationship between parties. I read that sentence 4 times. Then I took a photograph of it with my phone, uploaded it to the same private cloud folder as the Ashley messages, and wrote my attorney's name at the top of a fresh page on the legal pad. The third thing I found was smaller but, in some ways, the most clarifying. Receipt. Folded inside the accordion file's miscellaneous pocket, where I kept things that didn't have a category yet. The Lakeview Suites receipt from 14 months ago, the one I had printed when I found the charge in our joint account. $387. A date. His name on the billing. I had put it there without fully deciding what I was saving it for. Now I knew. What they didn't know was that I had been building this file for 14 months without realizing it. Every instinct I had quietly trusted and then talked myself out of. Every receipt I had printed, every date I had noted, every charge that didn't add up, was sitting in a cream-colored accordion file in my home office, organized, labeled, and ready. I closed the file, straightened the legal pad, and picked up my phone. I had 2 calls to make. My attorney first. Then my bank. I want to be very clear about something. I did not want revenge. What I wanted was precision. There is a difference. And the difference matters because revenge is emotional and impulsive and it makes mistakes, and I could not afford a single mistake. So for 9 days I was the most composed version of myself I have ever been. I went to work. I saw my patients. I smiled at the right moments during sessions and wrote my documentation at the end of each day with the same care I always had. I came home, made dinner on Tuesday because Tuesday was my night. And I listened to Daniel talk about his week with a focused, neutral expression of someone who has simply decided to stop feeling what they're feeling until the appropriate time. He had no idea. The first call I made was to my attorney, Karen Adler. I had used Karen when I incorporated my practice 4 years ago, and I trusted her the way you trust someone who has seen your financial records and still speaks to you without condescension. I reached her on a Friday morning between patient appointments. I told her without emotion that I needed to discuss initiating divorce proceedings in a fault state on grounds of adultery, and that I had documentation. Karen was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "How soon can you come in?" I was at her office that afternoon at 4:15 p.m. with the accordion file, my legal pad, a USB drive with a cloud folder backed up, and the yellow sticky note I had written that morning with every date and dollar amount I could remember in chronological order. Karen spent an hour and 40 minutes going through everything. She asked precise questions. She made notes. At the end, she set her pen down and said, "Elena, you've done most of my job for me." We talked through the fault-based filing. Our state allows divorce on grounds of adultery, and documented adultery affects certain asset calculations. Not always dramatically, but strategically. Given the timeline, the message history, and the Lakeview receipt, Karen was confident we had a documentable case. More importantly, we discussed the practice. The co-investment clause, Karen confirmed, was airtight. Daniel's $18,500 had purchased him a revenue interest position, not an equity stake. Under our state's marital property statute, a non-equity business interest in a spouse's pre-existing professional practice, particularly one with a clear contractual exclusion, could be argued as separate property. Combined with the fact that I had incorporated Marchetti Occupational Therapy LLC 8 months before Daniel and I were married, Karen was confident we could successfully argue the practice was entirely mine. "He'll try to claim the expansion capital," she said. "He contributed $18,500, I said. "The practice is worth $312,000 in annual revenue. He can have the interest returns he's owed. He can't have the practice." Karen smiled. "That's exactly what I'll tell his attorney." We filed the initial petition the following Wednesday. In the days before the filing, I did 3 other things quietly and without announcement. First, I separated my business finances completely. My practice had always had its own accounts, but there was one joint holding account Daniel had access to, a remnant of a tax strategy from 2 years earlier that we had never formally dissolved. I moved my portion to a new solo account on the Monday before filing. Clean, legal, documented. Second, I called our bank and formally redesignated the mortgage account servicing authority in my name alone, something the primary controller clause allowed me to do without Daniel's co-signature. The bank representative walked me through it in 11 minutes. Third, I changed the locks on the house. Not dramatically. Not while Daniel was home. I called a locksmith on a Tuesday afternoon while Daniel was at work and had 3 deadbolts rekeyed in 40 minutes. The locksmith charged me $180. I gave him a $20 tip. Kept 1 key. My attorney had a copy. On the Thursday evening, exactly 9 days after the night on Route 9, Daniel came home from work to find the front door key that lived on his keychain no longer fit the lock. There was a courier envelope on the porch mat, sealed, with his name on it in block letters. Inside was the divorce petition, the adultery documentation summary his attorney would need, and a single typed note that Karen had helped me word. Please coordinate all further communication through counsel. The practice of having conversations we both know are not honest is now concluded. I watched through the upstairs window as he stood on the porch and read it. He stood there for a long time. Then he sat down on the porch steps. And for the first time in 9 days, I exhaled. The divorce took 7 months. Not 7 months of screaming. Not 7 months of courtroom drama or shattered dishes or mutual friends forced to choose sides at dinner parties. 7 months of paperwork, scheduled calls between attorneys, and the quiet, procedural dismantling of a life I had built with someone who had been treating it as a temporary arrangement. Daniel hired an attorney within 4 days of receiving the petition. His attorney was competent. He pushed back on the practice valuation, as Karen had predicted, argued that Daniel's $18,500 contribution had created an implied equity interest regardless of the written agreement. Karen responded with the contract language, the LLC incorporation date, and a 12-page memo on our state's professional practice exemption statute. Daniel's attorney went quiet on that point and did not raise it again. What Daniel ultimately received in the settlement: his personal vehicle, the red Toyota he had driven away from me on Route 9, his individual retirement account, his personal savings, and the revenue interest returns he was legitimately owed from the practice expansion agreement, which Karen calculated at $6,240 based on the 2-year growth period. What I received: the house, clear title, the practice in full, my credit history, and the joint account reconciliation that showed, once Karen's forensic review was complete, that Daniel had used our shared household account to fund 11 months of a secondary relationship. Dinners, a weekend trip to a resort, flowers, a bracelet, totaling $4,380 in documented personal expenditures that had no business being in a joint account. The judge agreed. That $4,380 was deducted from Daniel's settlement share. It was not a dramatic number. It was not a number that made headlines. But there was something deeply satisfying about the specificity of it. The way every dinner he had charged, every small gift he had bought with our shared money, had been quietly receipted and returned. Ashley, as far as I know, moved on. I made a deliberate decision not to track what happened there. That story was never mine to tell. The last thing I did, 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, was have the cream-colored accordion file shredded. All of it. Every receipt, every note, every photograph printout. I kept the digital backups in the cloud folder. Karen advised that. But the physical file, the one I had built without knowing why, had served its purpose. I stood at the shredder for about 4 minutes watching it go through. And then I made coffee and sat on my front porch. My porch on my deed in my name, and listened to the rain. It was a Tuesday. It rained a lot that fall. I stopped minding it. There is something I have thought about often in the months since everything settled. Mrs. Patricia, the retired librarian in the gray Buick with a rosary on the mirror, who stopped on Route 9 and handed me a microfiber cloth and said, "You're going to be all right." She never knew what she drove me home to. She thought she was giving me a ride. She was actually giving me the 11 minutes I needed to decide who I was going to be next. Sometimes the kindness of a stranger is the only thing standing between you and a decision you'll regret. And sometimes, if you are paying attention, if you are the kind of person who keeps records and reads fine print and knows the difference between suspicion and proof, that 11 minutes is enough. I am Elena Marchetti. I kept my name professionally for a reason. Now I know exactly what that reason was. If you made it to the end of this story, I want you to sit with something for just a moment. Elena didn't win because she got lucky. She won because she had been quietly paying attention long before she had a reason to act. She kept the receipt she didn't know she'd need. She read the contract she signed. She called the attorney before she changed her expression. Most people, when they're hurt, go loud. They confront. They post. They react. And sometimes that costs them everything they could have kept. If you are somewhere in the middle of a situation that feels like Elena's, if something in this story landed a little too close, I want you to hear this. The most powerful thing you can do right now is nothing visible. Document, consult, breathe, and know your own name. If this story resonated with you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read more of those than you'd think. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to choose you every single day, I hope you remember that was never the truth about you. Like this video if Elena's story stayed with you. Subscribe if you're new here. There are more stories on this channel that I think you'll recognize yourself in. I'll see you in the next one.